Alright, let's talk about StoneCo. I was just in Brazil for 3 weeks. I did a lot of research into this company, how the business actually operates in Brazil, and I want to share two super important areas with investors for StoneCo or potential investors in StoneCo. Number one is related to the functionality of terminals and the saturation of the market, and area number two is with regards to stability and something I like to call favela chaos. There's a really surprising risk that I see in this company as a Western investor. Maybe that's why Warren Buffett sold, who knows. Alright, let's get straight into this market report. You're getting it directly from the source. I was in Brazil for 3 weeks and traveled around quite a bit in the city, paid by card on a lot of terminals. Indeed, there was quite a few StoneCo terminals. Remember, I did a post on the community tab showing this colorful terminal for payment processing. And in the restaurant where I first encountered it, every waiter had a StoneCo terminal in their back pocket. They used it to write up the different foods and drinks that I bought, and then for payment in the end. Was the terminal functional? Yes, indeed. Every time I paid by card, it worked. It was a debit card in the West, but in Brazil, apparently it counts as a credit card, and that can have some issues in some cases. I remember even an ATM had some trouble, one of those touristy ones with high fees. But the StoneCo terminal, never any issues. There was a lot of other payment processing terminals that we used. I saw StoneCo at a few locations, but the locations that didn't have, that I talked to, in where the person was able to speak a bit of English, well, then they were actually considering switching over. So there's potential for a lot of growth on the basis of taking market share for competition indeed. And functionality was very high. Never any issues with the terminal. And just to really drill home how saturated the market indeed was, I expected it to be a cash-based economy where there were payment processing terminals at a few places. However, get your head around this. Even a vendor at the beach in Copacabana, this guy walking around with a basically fedora bag on his belly where he was selling cold beers, agua de coco, water, had a payment processing terminal. So you could pay by card to this random beach vendor, and this was everywhere. Card processing payment terminals everywhere. A random guy trying to sell you cigarettes, payment processing terminal. A guy trying to sell you a caipirinha from this little stall, payment processing terminal. You could go to this market where they will sell street food, payment processing terminals. You could pay by card. So not as cash-based as I expected. All right, let's get into part number 2 about the high risk and the very low stability that we see in the Brazilian economy. I talked to a lot of expats who was living there and some business people from Sao Paulo that I was having a cigar with, and got a lot of information regarding the current situation. And indeed, it was as unstable as when I did market research, on the macroeconomics of Brazil like 8 years ago. There was still this talk about political instability. Some of the main points right now: congressman jailed for speaking, and ties to China with the current guy and the old guy. Bolsonaro is the old guy and Lola is the current guy. And there's just a lot of chaos on both sides. There's a lot going on. There's journalists leaving the country with regards to free speech. Facebook recently did a new implementation on features with regards to censorship as a result of a court order from Brazil. Although they didn't implement it only in Brazil, they implemented it worldwide. So it's having some impact indeed. A lot of chaos. I'm not going to talk too much about this. If you do some research on YouTube, you will find more information about this, it could fill out a 2-hour long video basically. But straight from the source, I heard the business people, I heard the expat talking about this instability. And indeed, it's a fact in Latin American economies. When speaking about StoneCo earlier, remember I talked about my plan being to wait for oversized dividends to be able to cash out capital of this economy. One example where we've seen this would be Petrobras. Remember the year where they had 85% dividend as a result of political powers pushing them to make this payout that was not sustainable based on the income statement and the balance sheet of Petrobras. But the government needed money for the budget, so they pushed through the large dividend anyways. Quite interesting way of doing business. This is one way to get capital out of Latin America that can be deployed at other areas where they can be effective and get good returns for investors. So as an investor, this is one of the ways that I'm looking to get capital out of Latin American economies. Basically get money back from the investment made earlier. And with regards to this absolute chaos that is in the economy, one super surprising fact I learned on a favela tour. I was out in a favela. I won't drop any names on the favela or the tour guide or anything like that. But basically, the main street of the favela pays taxes to the government. All the other side streets that are not even mapped on Google Maps do not pay taxes to the government. Where do they then pay taxes? Well, they pay to the cartel. So the cartel is controlling these huge area. Favela means neighborhood on a hill. The official figure of the favela that I was in for population was 300-something thousand people, although the guide told us that the real number was 400,000 something. So there's a lot of people living and doing businesses in this neighborhood. And indeed, there was payment terminals everywhere. You could pay by card. So they sold everything from fruits to clothes to having restaurants. Everything that you would have in a normal economy they had in this favela. You could meet all your basic needs there. And one of the Germans in the tour asked, well, they have these payment terminals. How come the government don't see the revenue stream? And the tour guide just made the joke, if I tell you that, I'm gonna have to, do that. But then after joking around a bit, he explained that I don't actually know how they do this, but they fudge around with the system somehow, and they mess around with these terminals so that they don't really see this revenue. The government don't really discover it, and they're able to just take it all and pay their cut to the cartel, basically. And that really makes you think, how do they fudge with these terminals so that the government is not able to collect tax? Are they cooperating with the companies that are providing the terminals, or are they hacking them in some way to be able to get around it? Is payment terminal companies able to collect revenue from transactions in some cases? Or like the renting out part of it, it's quite difficult to understand how they're actually collecting revenue in these cases from neighborhoods like this. And we know, obviously, the touristy area of Rio de Janeiro, no problem. Big city like Sao Paulo, where a lot of business is being done and the government has control, no problem. But, alright, favelas, we have some chaos, we have risk for revenue for companies such as StoneCo in places like that. How is it in rural Brazil? How is it in the rest of the country? I wouldn't know that since I haven't visited this, but this type of problem with corruption and fixing around, hacking, however they're doing terminals, that is an issue that I never thought about as a Western investor. And I know that the Germans were super surprised by this. Like, how can they not pay taxes to the government? How are they getting around this? Well, they're finding a way. And it's this type of chaos in the Latin American economies that's affecting companies like StoneCo, Petrobras, PagSeguro. That's making sure that the Price to earnings multiples will always be low for Latin American countries. They will never have those PE numbers that we're seeing Western companies have, and just this high risk really affects the way that we're doing discounted cash flow analysis. This type of risk is something that makes it difficult for the country to attract capital. We saw Warren Buffett selling out of StoneCo in this case, and I'm very aware of the high risk that my capital has when I invest in a company in an environment like this. And that's why I'm also expecting larger returns from it, and I'm expecting these oversized dividends from Latin American companies. And in order to attract more capital, indeed, that's what companies like StoneCo will need to do in the future. We're seeing stock price, it has gone quite nicely now in the last few months, but I think that in order for them to be able to reach those heights that they were on in the past, in a more favorable low rate environment. Remember, if you can only get a few percent from putting your money in the bank, well, then capital is going to seek risk, and risk they can find plenty of in countries in Latin America, such as Brazil in this case. Well, in order to attract more capital, again now in a high interest rate environment where investors just can put their money in the bank, they can buy some bonds, and they can be happy with that. Well, I think that they're going to have to issue dividends soon and to be able to attract capital again, to be able to increase stock price in a satisfactory way. But that's just my thoughts on the economy. I've done a lot of thinking about StoneCo as I was in Brazil, and I was contemplating this, looking out on the beautiful beaches, trying to wrap my head around the way business was being done in Brazil. And hopefully you found this research report to be extremely valuable directly from the source, talking about functionality, talking about market saturation, and talking about the instability and chaos of the region. Alright, that's been it for this video covering StoneCo, and as always, I hope you guys make a ton of money, whatever investments you decide to make. Take care now. Bye bye.